My uncle tried to take my $80,000 inheritance in court until the bank manager brought the original transfer file. The courtroom was cold that morning. Not just the temperature. The kind of cold that settles deep in your chest when you realize the people who are supposed to love you are now sitting on the other side of a wooden table, staring at you like you're a complete stranger. My Uncle Robert leaned back in his chair, the chair directly across from mine, and smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a polite one. The kind of smile that says, "I already know how this ends. And you don't." He looked at me the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved. My lawyer, Sandra, sat beside me with her hands folded on the table. She said nothing. I said nothing. Then the judge adjusted his glasses, looked up slowly from the stack of papers in front of him, and spoke. "I'd like to see the bank records." The courtroom door opened, and someone walked in that nobody in that room, not Robert, not his attorney, not a single one of the relatives sitting in the gallery, expected to see. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 38 years old. I work as a licensed physical therapist at a small rehabilitation clinic on the east side of town, the kind of place where the waiting room chairs are worn thin, and there are 2 potholes in the parking lot that nobody has fixed in 4 years. I like it there. The work is real. The people are real. Nobody performs anything. I grew up in a house where money was always the conversation that ended in silence. We didn't talk about what we didn't have. We simply learned to need less. That kind of upbringing either makes you bitter or it makes you careful. I chose careful. My Aunt Linda, my father's older sister, was one of the most constant people in my life for as long as I can remember. She never had children of her own. She had a small house on a quiet street, a garden she was enormously proud of, and opinions she was never afraid to share. She used to say, "Natalie, the world doesn't reward the loudest person in the room. It rewards the one who stays when everyone else leaves." I didn't fully understand what she meant when I was young. I understand it completely now. For years, especially as Aunt Linda's health began to slowly decline, I was there. Every week, sometimes twice a week. Doctor's appointments, pharmacy runs, grocery trips, yard work she could no longer manage on her own, home repairs that had been sitting on a list for months. I wasn't keeping a record of any of it. I wasn't calculating anything. She was family and she needed help, and showing up was simply what you did for family. Meanwhile, my Uncle Robert, the oldest sibling on that side of the family, appeared when it was convenient for him. Holidays sometimes. The occasional birthday. But mostly, he materialized when there was something to gain. I watched this pattern for years and said nothing, because Aunt Linda loved him, and it wasn't my place to say otherwise. I wasn't rich. I didn't have lawyers on retainer or powerful connections making phone calls on my behalf. I had a modest salary, a used car with 140,000 miles on it, and a reputation for showing up when it mattered. And I had one other thing, something my uncle never once accounted for. Every single piece of the truth. If you've ever watched a relative materialize out of nowhere the exact moment money entered a conversation, suddenly full of opinions, suddenly full of claims, suddenly speaking with an authority they never once earned, then you already understand the shape of this story. You know that particular feeling. The one where you look across a room at someone who shares your blood and realize you are looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. This channel exists for those experiences. The ones that are too complicated to explain at a family dinner and too painful to simply leave behind. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It genuinely helps this community grow. And if something in this story speaks to something you've lived through, leave a comment. I read them. Your story belongs here too. Now let me take you back to the day everything began to unravel. The day of the funeral. Aunt Linda passed on a Tuesday in early spring. The funeral was quiet, exactly the way she would have wanted it. No dramatic eulogies. No unnecessary performances of grief. A few old hymns, a pastor who had known her for 30 years, and a room full of people who genuinely, simply missed her. The reception afterward was held at a small community hall 2 blocks from her house. Folding tables. Casseroles in aluminum pans. People standing in clusters, speaking in that careful, hushed register people use when they're not quite sure what to say, but feel they need to say something. I stood near the window, holding a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, watching my family move through grief, or at least move through their version of it. Robert arrived 20 minutes late. He hugged two cousins, shook a few hands, accepted a plate of food, and then, before Aunt Linda had been in the ground for 3 hours, he started talking about the estate. I watched him move from group to group around that community hall, leaning in close, lowering his voice. I couldn't hear the words from across the room, but I didn't need to. I could read the body language. This wasn't grief. This was inventory. This was a man walking through a room calculating what was now available. I told myself, the legal process will handle this. There's a will. There's an estate attorney. This will be sorted correctly and cleanly. I was wrong. The letter that changed everything. A week after the funeral, I received a certified letter. Formal. Official. Stamped with a probate court return address. The kind of envelope you open slowly because you already sense that what's inside is going to cost you something. The letter informed me that the $80,000 transfer Aunt Linda had personally arranged into my account several months before her death had been legally frozen, pending a court hearing to determine its legitimacy. I sat with that letter for a long time. Read it 3 times. My hands were steady. Something behind my sternum was not. I contacted Aunt Linda's estate attorney the next morning. And that is when I learned exactly what Robert had done. He had filed a claim in probate court arguing that the transfer was not legitimate. His legal position was that I had manipulated Aunt Linda, an elderly woman in declining health, into moving a significant sum of money into my account through coercion and undue influence. He claimed she had not been in a sound enough state of mind to make that decision on her own. He claimed I had taken advantage of her vulnerability. He was telling this story to relatives too. At a family dinner I was not invited to, he reportedly stood up and said it clearly, in front of everyone. Natalie took advantage of a sick old woman. She knew exactly what she was doing, and we're going to prove it in court. Word reached me through a cousin who felt guilty about not telling me sooner. I sat in my car outside my clinic that afternoon and let the full weight of it land. The accusation. The image Robert was actively constructing of me. The version of Natalie Brooks he was presenting to people who had watched me grow up, people who had been at my birthday parties, who had known my parents, who had sat at the same Thanksgiving tables I had. He was turning my years of caregiving into evidence against me. And then I drove home, sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of water, and started thinking clearly. Because here's the thing about the truth. It does not require your permission. It does not need you to defend it loudly or constantly. It simply needs the right moment to be heard. Escalation 1. Robert takes the stand. The first probate hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning. The courtroom was not large or grand, nothing like the ones in films. Fluorescent lighting, beige walls that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations. A judge who had clearly presided over hundreds of cases exactly like this and was determined to move through this one with measured efficiency. Robert arrived like a man walking into a business meeting he had already won. Dark suit, polished shoes. 2 cousins flanking him like they were colleagues. He did not look at me when he walked past my table. I sat with Sandra, my attorney, a quiet, methodical woman who had told me during our very first meeting, "Don't react to anything he says in that room. Not a word, not a look, not a breath. Let me do my job and trust the process." Robert's attorney opened with a carefully constructed narrative. Natalie Brooks, the devoted niece, had suddenly begun appearing at Aunt Linda's home every single day during her final months. Wasn't that interesting? Wasn't the timing worth examining? The question wasn't whether Natalie cared about her aunt. The question was why that caring had intensified so dramatically in direct proximity to a significant financial transfer. It was crafted precisely to sound reasonable while implying something terrible. Robert testified next. He was composed and deliberate, the kind of witness who has thought carefully about how he wants to be perceived. He described me in language that was never quite direct enough to be easily challenged, but pointed enough to leave a mark. Funny how she started showing up every single day once money was involved. Nobody in this family ever had a problem with Linda before all of this. I looked at the table in front of me. Sandra touched my arm, lightly. I said nothing. Escalation 2, the family turns. 3 of my cousins gave brief statements. I understood, even then, that they were in an impossible position. Robert had spent weeks working them, planting doubt quietly, offering his version of events as though it were settled fact, making them feel like questioning me was an act of loyalty to the family rather than a betrayal of it. But sitting there and listening to people I had grown up with describe my years of consistent, genuine caregiving as somehow suspicious, that was its own particular variety of pain. The kind that doesn't announce itself immediately. It settles in slowly, later, when you're alone. One cousin said, carefully, "She did seem to become more involved during that period. She didn't look at me when she said it." Another said he couldn't speak to my motivations. Robert's attorney used each statement methodically, layering them into a pattern, building the impression, brick by careful brick, that something calculated had happened in that quiet house with the rose garden. Escalation 3. The legal pressure mounts. Robert's attorney then made his central legal argument directly. Elderly financial transfers executed during periods of declining health are, by their nature, inherently suspicious, he argued. They are precisely the circumstances that individuals with bad intentions seek to exploit. He requested that the court freeze the inheritance entirely and return the funds to the estate until the matter was fully resolved, framing it as a protective measure for Aunt Linda's legacy. He made it sound like he was the one honoring her. Then he said, "We are fully prepared to argue that no legitimate documentation exists to support the validity of this transfer. We fully expect that when documentation is requested by this court, none will be produced." He said it with the casual confidence of someone who had already checked and found nothing. Robert caught my eye from across the room at that moment. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The expression said everything. "It's over. You have nothing." Sandra requested additional time to gather documentation. The judge granted a 2-week recess. As we filed out of the courtroom, Robert passed close enough for me to hear him say quietly to one of his cousins, "There won't be any documents. Trust me." He said it like a fact. He said it like the matter was already closed. That night, I drove to Aunt Linda's house. I still had a key. She had given it to me years earlier and told me to use it whenever I needed to think somewhere quiet. I let myself in through the back gate and sat in her garden as the light faded. The garden was overgrown now. Nobody had been tending it, but the roses she had planted along the back fence were still there. Still stubborn. Still blooming without anyone asking them to. I sat there and thought about the day we went to the bank. It was a Wednesday, several months before she passed. Aunt Linda had called me the evening before and said she wanted to make a trip, not to the doctor, not to the pharmacy, to the bank. She had something she needed to do in person, and she wanted me to drive her. I didn't ask many questions. I picked her up the next morning. She was quiet most of the drive, watching the streets go by with the particular stillness of someone who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at their decision. When we arrived at the bank, she asked to speak with someone about a personal transfer. The branch manager, a woman named Patricia Lowe, came out herself because of the amount involved. She brought us into a small glass-walled office, sat down across from us, and spoke directly and carefully to Aunt Linda. Not to me, to Aunt Linda. She asked her to confirm she understood the nature of the transaction, the amount, the recipient. She asked if Aunt Linda had made this decision freely and without pressure from anyone. She had a staff member present as a witness. She required multiple signatures on multiple documents. Aunt Linda did all of it without hesitation, without looking at me for approval, without any uncertainty at all. And before we left, as we were putting our coats back on in the lobby, Aunt Linda said something to me that I had not thought about in months, not until I was sitting in that courtroom listening to Robert build his case. "You're the only one who has actually been here for me, Natalie. I've watched you show up, year after year, when you had absolutely no obligation to. This isn't charity. This is clarity." Sitting in her garden that night, I began to understand what I had been too distracted by grief and shocked to realize. That day at the bank wasn't just a transfer. It was a documented legal process. The bank had required it to be. Every step had been recorded. The authorization, the witness signatures, the identity verification, the time-stamped transaction records. I called Sandra at 9 o'clock that night. "I need you to contact the bank," I said. There should be records from an in-person transfer, a signed authorization, a branch manager who personally supervised the entire process. I was there. I watched it happen. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, Natalie, if that documentation exists, he is going to lose this case. Completely. The next 2 weeks moved like standing water, slow and flat on the surface, but churning with pressure underneath. Sandra moved quickly. She contacted the bank the following morning and began the process of formally requesting the transfer records. She also reached out to Mr. Douglas Carter, an older attorney who had handled Aunt Linda's estate planning years before Robert's name was ever connected to any legal proceedings. Mr. Carter was in his late 60s, deliberate and precise in the way that people become when they have spent decades measuring their words before releasing them. He had known Aunt Linda for a long time, not simply as a client, but as a person. He remembered her clearly. He remembered the conversations she had about her wishes, about who she trusted, about who showed up for her when it cost something and who appeared only when there was something available. He agreed to assist Sandra quietly, helping locate old estate documents, providing professional context about Aunt Linda's mental clarity and stated intentions in the years before her death.
He was not dramatic about it.
He simply believed that the truth should be properly documented and that he was in a position to help ensure it was. Meanwhile, Robert continued performing certainty. At a family birthday gathering I did not attend, multiple people reported that he spoke openly and confidently about the case. He told relatives I had no real evidence, that the money would be returned to the estate, and that the whole matter would be resolved quickly. He spoke about it the way someone speaks about a problem that has already been solved, with the particular ease of a man who has never once seriously imagined being wrong. That kind of certainty, when it has no foundation beneath it, is one of the most dangerous things there is. It spreads. People believe it because the person speaking it believes it so completely. 3 days before the next hearing, Sandra called me. The bank confirmed it, she said. The transfer records are fully intact. The original authorization is signed and witnessed. The branch manager, Ms. Lowe, has agreed to appear in court and bring the complete original file. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Robert doesn't know this is coming, Sandra continued. His attorney has no idea. As far as they are both concerned, no documentation exists. They built their entire case on that assumption, that there would be nothing. I thought about Robert in that parking lot outside the courthouse, saying trust me like a man who had already counted the money. Good, I said. I went to bed that night and slept better than I had in an entire month. The second hearing felt different from the moment I walked through the door. More relatives had come this time. Word had traveled that the case was reaching its conclusion, and people wanted to see how it ended. I recognized faces from the funeral reception, some who had stopped returning my calls in the weeks after Robert made his accusations. Some who had believed his version of events without ever once asking me for mine. They were all here now to watch. Robert sat at his table with the same expression he had maintained throughout this entire process, composed, certain, faintly amused. His attorney arranged documents in front of him with the practiced calm of someone expecting a smooth and brief proceeding. Sandra and I sat at our table. She had one folder.
Clean. Organized.
She looked like someone who had already done all the difficult work and was now simply waiting for the correct moment to show it. The judge opened the proceedings. Robert's attorney reiterated his position for the record. No legitimate documentation existed. The transfer had been irregular and suspicious in nature. The estate should be made whole. It was familiar language. He had said it before and believed he would say it one final time today. The judge turned to Sandra. Counsel, does your client have documentation to present? We do, Your Honor, Sandra said. And we'd like to call a witness. A brief pause. The judge nodded. Sandra turned toward the back of the courtroom. The court calls Ms. Patricia Lowe, branch manager of Riverside Community Bank. The door opened. She walked in carrying a large manila envelope and a thick-bound folder, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had testified before and understood exactly what she was doing and why she was there. Robert's expression changed. Not dramatically, he didn't gasp, didn't visibly collapse. But it changed. The certainty drained from his face in a single moment, like water leaving a glass. In its place, recognition.
He knew who she was.
He knew what her presence meant. And he knew, in that moment, that the foundation his entire case was built on, the assumption that there was nothing, had just walked into the room carrying a folder full of everything. Ms. Lowe was sworn in. Sandra guided her carefully through the events of that Wednesday morning. The visit, the office, the process, the documentation. Ms. Lowe described it all with precision. The amount. The protocols followed for transfers of that particular size. The requirements she was legally obligated to fulfill before any such transaction could be processed. Our policy requires in-person confirmation from the account holder, written authorization signed and dated in our presence, independent witness documentation, and full identity verification, Ms. Lowe stated clearly. Every one of those steps was completed on that date, in that branch, in my presence. She opened the folder. One by one, she placed the documents on the table before the judge. The original transfer authorization, signed by Aunt Linda in her own handwriting with the date clearly marked. The identity verification log. The independent witness signatures. The time-stamped internal records showing the exact minute the transaction had been initiated, processed, reviewed, and confirmed. A complete and unbroken chain of documentation. Robert's attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently to him. Robert's jaw tightened. And then Robert did something that I believe surprised even his own attorney. He interrupted. Those documents could have been altered. You can't prove that those are. Ms. Lowe turned toward him with the calm of someone who is completely unbothered. Mr. Brooks, our transaction records are maintained in a secure banking system with full audit logs. Every document presented today carries a digital timestamp and a unique transaction ID that corresponds directly to a permanent record in our core banking system, a record that cannot be edited, deleted, or altered after processing. I have also brought the original physical documents, which have been stored in our secure records vault since the day of the transaction. She said all of it without raising her voice, without a trace of irritation. Just facts, stated plainly, by a person who had nothing whatsoever to hide. The room was silent. The judge reviewed the documents slowly and carefully. His reading glasses moved down each page in measured silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. You could hear the air in the room. Robert's attorney asked to approach the bench. The judge waved him off with a single small gesture. Then the judge set the folder down, removed his glasses, and spoke. I have reviewed the documentation presented by the witness today. The transfer in question was completed legally, with proper written authorization from the account holder, independently witnessed and recorded in complete accordance with standard banking procedures and applicable law. There is no evidence, none, that this transaction was coerced, improperly executed, or conducted in bad faith. The claim against Ms. Brooks is dismissed in its entirety. He looked up. Mr. Brooks, I want to be direct with you. Filing a claim of this nature, one that impugns the character of a family member and disrupts a legitimate estate process, without substantive supporting evidence, is a serious matter. This court does not take such accusations lightly. I would strongly advise you to consider the full gravity of what was alleged in this room today before you consider pursuing any further action. The gavel came down. And that was it. People don't applaud in courtrooms. They just sit there, absorbing what they've witnessed. And then they stand up slowly and file out into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights are the same and the air is slightly warmer, and the world has quietly shifted while everyone was sitting still. Robert walked out without looking at anyone. The cousins who had flanked him on the first day followed half a step behind now, suddenly uncertain of the confidence they had borrowed from him for weeks. They had lent him their belief, and he had spent it on nothing. Some relatives approached me in the hallway. Most of them couldn't quite meet my eyes directly when they spoke. They said they were sorry, that they should have waited, that they should have asked me for my version of events before accepting his, that they knew, really, they had always known that I wasn't that kind of person. I thanked them, because there was nothing else to say, and because I meant it, not for their defense of me, but for their willingness to admit, even awkwardly, that they had been wrong. Sandra and I stood by her car in the parking lot afterward for few quiet minutes. She said I had handled it well. I told her I couldn't have done any of it without her. We both knew, without saying it, who had actually made it possible. Aunt Linda, the woman who had insisted on going to the bank in person, who had signed every document clearly and without hesitation, who had made sure in her own quiet, deliberate way that when this moment came, the truth would be exactly where it needed to be. I used part of the inheritance to make a donation to the community garden program that Aunt Linda had volunteered with for the better part of a decade. The rest I kept, not because I needed a financial victory to feel justified, but because she had wanted me to have it, and she had made certain that the world would know that. The rest of the story I carried home with me and set down. Not every wound needs a monument. Not every injustice needs to become the thing that defines you. She had told me once, in that garden, the truth doesn't need you to shout it, Natalie. It just needs the right moment to be heard. She was right. She always was. Financial betrayal within families is one of the most disorienting things a person can experience because it doesn't only threaten what you own. It threatens your understanding of who your family actually is. It makes you look at people who share your history and wonder how well you ever really knew them. If someone in your family has ever used a moment of loss or vulnerability, a death, an illness, a transition, to reach for something that wasn't theirs, then you know what it feels like to sit across a table from someone who once called themselves your relative and see a stranger looking back at you. If this story reached you, if you've lived something like it, or watched someone you love go through it, share your experience in the comments below. This community was built on those stories. On the people who held on to the truth even when it cost them something. On the ones who stayed quiet because they trusted the process, even when the process was painful and slow. Subscribe if you haven't already. Click hype if this story reached you. And thank you genuinely for being here.